Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the 8th South-South Forum on Sustainability. The theme is the politics of hope, people's resilience and resistance in catastrophic times. Today we have lecture 10, Africa and the Politics of Hope, Love and Rebellion by Dr. Firoze MANJI. We provide English, Chinese, and Spanish simultaneous interpretation. You can choose the interpretation at the bottom of the computer screen. We would like to thank today's interpreters, Lola Lafanchis, Melissa Ruffini, Liang Ying, and Yang Xiangluo. May I first introduce the co-moderator for today's section. My name is Xue Cui, Margaret Jadi. I am Associate Professor at the Institute of Rural Reconstruction of China, Southwest University. I am a board member of Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives and one of the founding members of Global University for Sustainability. I have been actively involved in the rural reconstruction movement in China since 2000. Gustave Marcel is an engineer and economics. Currently, he is member of the International Council of World Social Forum. He is representative of the Center of Research and Information on Development, coalition of 54 French associations for international solidarity. He is also member of the Scientific Council of ATTEC and former vice president of ATTEC France. He is founder members of INTERCOLL and of the Center for Research and Initiative for International Solidarity, and also Initiative for Another World. Previously, he was former professor at the Architectural School of Paris, La Villette. He was former General Secretary of the International League for the Rights and Liberation of Peoples.
I would first like to congratulate and thanks Sid Margaret Jade and Kinchi for their remarkable work for the Global University for Sustainability and the impressive 8th South-South session. It is a wonderful example of internationalism and alter-globalism. It is not easy to give a brief introduction to Firoze MANJI, given all that he has contributed in 40 years of activities in international development, health, and human rights. Firoze is a Kenyan now resident in Quebec. He is a researcher, a teacher, and an activist who has marked all these activities. He is PhD, he has a Doctor of Philosophy, Master of Science, Dental Public Health, and Bachelor of Dental Surgery. He is adjunct professor at the Institute of African Studies in Ottawa, Canada. He is the recipient of the 2021 Nicolas Christ Global Guillem Batista Lifetime Achievement Award from the Caribbean Philosophic Association. He is a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin, visiting fellow at Kellogg College, University of Oxford, and associate fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies. He is a senior research fellow at the Global Center of Advanced Studies. He had previously worked as Africa Program Director for Amnesty International, Chief Executive of the AGA Foundation, Regional Representative for Health Science in Eastern and Southern Africa for the Canadian International Development Research Center, researcher at the Kenya Medical Research, and lecturer in the Faculty of Medicine in Nairobi. He was a member of the editorial board of the journal Development in Practice, a founding member of the steering group on the campaign for the ratification of the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa, Solidarity for African Women's Rights. He has been a member of the International Advisory Board of the Center for the Study of Global Media and Democracy at the University of London. He is member of the editorial board of Awaz magazine. He served as a member of the Permanent People's Tribunal on the role of transnational corporation in Southern Africa. He is a former member of the board of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy at Greenpeace Africa. He has published widely on health, human rights, development, and politics. He is co-editor with Shokari Ekin of African Awakening, The Emerging Revolutions, and co-editor with Bill Fletcher of Claim No Easy Victories, The Legacy of Amilcar Cabral. Firoze has been very active as an editorial writer and as a publisher. He is the publisher of Daraja Press. He is the founder and former editor-in-chief of the prize-winning Pan-African Social Justice newsletter and website Pambazuka News and Pambazuka Press at Fahumu Books. Pambazuka is a considerable reference, a journal of the African radical movement of emancipation. He is a member of the editorial review board of Global Critical Caribbean Thought, a member of the editorial board of Noboko, Journal of the Institute of African Studies, and a member of the International Advisory Board of the journal Philosophy and Global Affairs. So thank you, Firoze, to be with us, and I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for those kind words, Gustave, and special thanks to the South-South Sustainability Forum, Kinchi Lau and Jenny and others for inviting me to speak at this event. The title of my talk is Africa and the Politics of Love and Rebellion. It perhaps might help if I started by articulating my main argument. Since its birth, capital has always defined two spaces: a sacred space occupied by the owners of capital and their allies, those they themselves consider to be human, and a sacrificial zone comprising everyone else who they consider to be less than human or not human at all. Who belongs to each zone changes over time depending on the nature of the struggle of the peoples of the sacrifice zones and the concessions made by the sacred zones. But those divisions have continued to be fundamental nature of the rule of capital, of capitalist democracy, of colonialism, of social democracy, of independence, of neocolonialism, indeed even at the start of industrial capitalism in England. The creation of sacrifice zones, the appropriation and privatization of land. The sacred zone is maintained by the use of extreme violence against the occupiers of the sacrifice zones to ensure their continued existence as dehumanized populations. But the irony is that in seeking to render others less than human, the oligarchs of the sacred zone end up becoming profoundly dehumanized themselves. And because of the violence, exploitation, and oppression experienced by those in the sacrifice zones, the people of these zones have the most profound understanding of what it means to be human. And in their organizing for freedom and emancipation, they engage in inventing what it truly means to be human, a universalist humanity that is founded on the principles of love and freedom. Secondly, I argue that the conditions of being African was a creation of Europe, a synonym for the non-human or lesser human being that justified enslavement, slavery, colonialism, exploitation, and oppression. The specific terminology evolved subsequently to consider the African as uncivilized under colonialism and then underdeveloped in the post-independence period. The struggle against enslavement, slavery, exploitation, and national liberation represented the assertion by Africans of their humanity, and as human beings, as makers of history, as contributors to the history of human emancipation internationally. When the term African becomes devoid of or disarticulated from any connection with the struggle for emancipation and freedom, as it did in the aftermath of independence, it becomes indistinguishable from the taxonomy of race and of identity politics created by the European that identifies Africa rather than the continued exploitation of its people and resources as the problem. So long as the experiences arising from the emancipatory struggles are perceived as being merely African, it is not possible to understand their contribution to universal humanity. That is only possible if the politics of the African experience are transcended and considered as part of the human condition that, as Amilcar Cabral puts it, belong to the whole world. Before the 15th century, Europe did not exist. It was merely a collection of feudal, mercantile, tribal towns, farms, villages, small states, all at war with each other. It had few natural resources, and its social system meant that it was deeply impoverished. Europe was invented in the process of inventing Africa. Europe was invented by pushing outwards, not because of its wealth, but because of its poverty. Colonialism gave European states common interests in slavery, plantations, the world market, looting, rape, genocide, territorial grabbing, spices, trade in spices, precious metals, and so on. To invent itself, it had to render those populations of the African continent as being less than human to justify the destruction of the people and their civilization. It was Europe who invented the term African. The peoples of the continent never defined themselves thus before the 15th century. This was a land of many different civilizations, many different empires, city-states, but also many different social formations, including despotic communalism. But in inventing the African, Europe invented itself just as by racializing the black allowed the invention of the racialized white. Africa thus became the shorthand from the 15th century onwards for the non-human. The ideological justification was for white supremacy, required the destruction of African city-states, empires, and its trade routes. Excuse me. History was rewritten to invent the European supremacists, erasure of memory of the Iberian Peninsula being part of the African Empire of Andalusia that lasted more than 700 years until it was defeated in 1492, giving rise to the Spanish Inquisition, the expulsion of Africans and Jews, the destruction of science, astrology, mathematics, culture, and a culture of violence and terror, if not torture, of the population. 1492 was also the year Columbus began the genocidal move of Europe into the Americas and Caribbean. White supremacy leading to domination of all other peoples of the Americas and as Asia as well. There was the capture, enslavement, terror, genocide, and mass killings and destructions of all the existing civilizations to be found on the African continent. Too much emphasis is usually placed by scholars in counting only the bodies that were taken away from the continent who died in the Middle Passage and survived to be chattel slaves in the Americas. But you have to understand, we cannot ignore the plunder and killings against the resistance of African people that was carried out in order for the slave trade to be possible. Leopold Senghor and others have put the loss at about 200 million people. That is approximately 1/3 of the entire population of the continent at the time of what there were 600 million souls. The capture of slaves, the destruction of societies, made possible not only by the force of arms, but by collusion of existing despotic rulers of both class societies and some of those despotic communal societies. The crucial aspect here is that the entire basis of colonization and colonial rule has always involved the nurturing, feeding, and arming of collaborators. There was resistance everywhere. There are many histories about this, but just to give an idea, that in the Congo, from the Khoikhoi herders against the Portuguese in Kilwe, in Zanj, Mombasa, Mambaza, Ethiopia, Sao Tome, Zambezia, Pemba, Tete province, Madagascar, Angola, Cape region of South Africa, Sierra Leone, Ghana, the destruction of Fort Jesus, the Portuguese Fort Jesus in East Africa, and so on and so forth, and often involving the killing of collaborators with the European invaders. The most important resistance, which is often ignored in the telling of the history of Africa, was the Saint-Domingue revolution by African slaves, recently brought from Africa to the island of Saint-Domingue. The revolution of 1791-1804, which led to the establishment of the Haitian state, the first successful slave rebellion that led to establishment of a state. And it was based on the defeat of the British, the French, the Spanish by slaves. And it was not just the first successful slave revolution, but it was also one in which there was a proclamation of a universalist humanity declared by defining people politically, not racially. The Atlantic slave trade, plantations, genocide of indigenous people, the sugar, tobacco plantations, the looting, all led to massive capital accumulation and wealth transferred to Europe, and provided the wealth and the leisure for the birth of the European Enlightenment. Enlightenment, what a word, a celebration of the white skin, the lightened skin, and the condemnation of dark Africa and the inscrutable Asian, and of course, forgotten genocides of the indigenous people of the Americas and Caribbeans. The European Enlightenment cast a shadow of erasure over the histories and civilizations of Africa and darkened the continent by virtue of the violence and destruction cast on the people of the continent. The Enlightenment is celebrated by Europeans as giving birth to liberalism. But liberalism itself was itself constructed by the existence and expansion of the sacred and sacrificial zones. Liberalism gave birth to racism. It was liberalism that created the conditions for the establishment of modern democracy. But let us look at that carefully. In the United States, the birth of modern democracy enabled only white male slave owners to be allowed to vote. Even the women folk of the slave owners were not permitted to vote. Similarly, in England, only landowners and the property classes, especially those who had colonized Ireland, were allowed to vote. Everyone else was considered to be part of the sacrifice zones because they were considered less than human, or in the case of Africans, not human at all. The modern capitalist democracy has always been an exclusivist project. All the political gains that have happened since the beginning by those in the sacrifice zones has been the result of the organizing and mobilization of the people of that zone, forcing concessions from the occupiers of the sacred zones and making history by their direct actions. For the sacred zones to survive require the use of extreme violence against those in the sacrifice zones, while at the same time recruiting collaborators, police, armed forces from amongst those very people of the sacrifice zones. The methods of rule used in the colonial project were fundamentally fascist in nature. As Aimé Césaire pointed out, why Europe's humanistic bourgeoisie could not forgive Hitler wasn't because of the crimes he committed, but, quote, the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures, which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the so-called niggers of America, and so-called natives of Africa. This form of rule was characterized by Domenico Losordo in his extraordinary book, Liberalism, A Counter-History, as a Herrenvolk democracy. Herrenvolk being the term used later by the Nazis in Germany to refer to the master race. So this was a master race democracy, and has remained fundamentally that ever since. The rise of Nazism was new for Europe, wrote Hosea Jaffe. But something indistinguishable from it had long existed in many parts of Africa. The absolute totalitarian dictatorship of monopoly capital, fused with the state dictatorship of the combination of monopoly capital and the state, that is an essential part of Nazism and fascism. This dictatorship shared another essential factor with the later European dictatorships, a mass social base in the middle class, such as was found in Germany, Italy, Spain, and so on. In Africa, this popular base was found internally in those countries which had white settlers, amongst the colons and the settlers of all classes, farmers, traders, and workers. But besides the settler aggregate of classes, such as was found in southern Africa, Kenya, and Algeria, colonial Nazism had another popular base, the alliance of workers and capitalists in the dominant foreign countries. In a real sense, it was the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, and not in the flames of the Reichstag half a century later, that Nazism was created. I think this is a really important point made by Hosea Jaffe. The industrial workers of the North wanted socialism at home, but at the same time, the continuity of colonialism that guaranteed its luxuries and privileges as a labor aristocracy. That holds as much today, and perhaps even more today, than it did at the time of the rise of colonial ventures. The creation and maintenance of these two zones was at the heart of the colonial project. The colonial powers created the sacrifice zones through widespread use of genocide, mass killings, imprisonment, sexual abuse, torture, forced labor, all forms of brutality, floggings, and extrajudicial killings for the most trivial acts. The judicial system was created to protect the interests of the colonial powers. Looting and land grabbing and the handing over to colonizers land and privilege exclusively to their own kind or to their allies. Thus, corruption was at the heart of the colonial system. Leaders of protest movements were, of course, summarily executed. The ideological framework for colonialism required the destruction of pre-existing cities and civilizations in Africa, to remove reference to the culture, social, economic, scientific, artistic heritage that was rich across the continent. That was a prerequisite for the ideologues such as Hegel and other so-called philosophers of the liberal tradition to claim that Africa had no history. The faith in the superiority of the culture of the sacred space, combined with Christianity's missionary zeal, laid the foundations for empire and the spread of Christendom. After the slave trade, armed conquest, and colonial wars, wrote Amilcar Cabral, the Guinea-Bissau revolutionary, there came complete destruction of the economic and social structure of African societies. The next phase was European occupation and ever-increasing European immigration into those territories. The lands and possessions of Africans were looted. Colonial powers established control by imposing taxes, enforcing compulsory crops, introducing forced labor, excluding Africans from particular jobs, removing them from the most fertile regions, and establishing native authorities consisting of collaborators. Cabral pointed out that whatever the material aspects of domination, quote, it can be maintained only by the permanent and organized repression of the cultural life of the people concerned. Of course, domination could only be completely guaranteed by the elimination of a significant part of the population, as for example in the genocide of the Herero peoples in southern Africa, or in the many indigenous nations of the Americas. But in practice, this was not always feasible, and indeed often not seen as a desirable point from the point of view of empire. In Cabral's words, the ideal for foreign domination, whether imperialist or not, would be to choose either to liquidate practically all the population in the dominated country, thereby eliminating the possibilities for cultural resistance, or to succeed imposing itself without damaging the culture of the dominated people. That is, to harmonize economic and political domination of these people with their cultural personality. The use of violence to dominate a people is, argued Cabral, above all to take up arms to destroy or at least neutralize and paralyze their cultural life. For as long as a part of the people have a cultural life, foreign domination cannot be assured of its perpetuation. The reason for this is clear. Culture is not a mere artifact or expression of aesthetics, custom, or tradition. It is a means by which people assert their opposition to domination, a means to proclaim and invent their own humanity, a means to assert agency and the capacity to make history. In a word, culture is one of the fundamental tools of the struggle for emancipation. Culture is an expression of both love and of rebellion. For Cabral, culture has a material base. Quote, the product of this history, just as a flower is the product of a plant. Like history, or because it is history, culture has as its material base the level of the productive forces and the mode of production. Culture, says Cabral, plunges its roots into the physical reality of the environmental humus in which it develops and reflects the organic nature of the society. Culture, insists Cabral, is intimately linked to the struggle for freedom. While culture comprises many aspects, it, quote, grows deeper through the people's struggles and not just through songs, poems, and folklore. One cannot expect, said Cabral, African culture to advance unless one contributes realistically to the creation of the conditions necessary for this culture, i.e., the liberation of the continent. In other words, culture is not static and unchangeable, but it advances only through the engagement in the struggle for freedom. National liberation as culture is the phenomenon in which socioeconomic whole rejects the denial of its historical process. In other words, the national liberation of a people is the regaining of the historical personality of that people. It is their return to history through the destruction of imperialist domination to which they were subject. Or as Frantz Fanon put it, to fight for national culture first of all means fighting for the liberation of the nation, the tangible matrix upon which culture can grow. One cannot divorce the combat for culture from the people's struggle for liberation. National culture is no folklore. It is the collective thought process of a people to describe, justify, and extol the actions whereby they have joined forces and remained strong. The struggle of people in Africa has always focused on land. But it is important here for us to acknowledge and recognize that land is not the same as territory. Territory is premised on private ownership, whereas land has to be conceptualized as a place of memory, of history, of culture, of ancestry, of beliefs, of social relations, of love, of languages, histories, and capacities to produce, organize, tell stories, invent, love, make music, sing songs, make poetry, create art, philosophize, reflect, all those things that make a people human. Attempts to remove people from their land is not merely their disarticulation from property, but something more profound, more spiritual, as well as material. But the people of the sacrifice zones have never been passive. The resounding claim of every movement in opposition to enslavement, every slave revolt, every opposition to colonization, every challenge to the institutions of white supremacy, every resistance to racism, every resistance to oppression or to patriarchy constituted an assertion of human identity. Where Europeans considered Africans to be subhuman, the response was to claim the identity of African as a positive, liberating definition of a people who are part of humanity, who, as Cabral put it, belong to the whole world. And as Paulo Freire was to proclaim, but while both humanization and dehumanization are real alternatives, only the first is the people's vocation. The vocation is constantly negated, but it is affirmed by that very negation. It is thwarted by injustice, exploitation, oppression, and the violence of the oppressors. It is affirmed by the yearning of the oppressed for freedom and justice, and by their struggle to recover their lost humanity. If being cast as African was originally defined as being less than human, or not human at all, the resounding claim of every movement in opposition to enslavement, every slave revolt, every opposition to colonization, every challenge to the institutions of white supremacy, every resistance to racism, every resistance to oppression, to patriarchy, constituted an assertion of human identity. Where Europeans considered Africans to be subhuman, the response was to claim the identity of African as a positive, liberating definition of a people who are a part of humanity, who belong to the whole world. As in the struggles of the oppressed throughout history, a transition occurs in which the terms used by the oppressors to other people to denigrate them are eventually appropriated by the oppressed and turned into terms of dignity and assertion of humanity. It was thus that the concept of being African became intimately associated with the concept of freedom and emancipation. The people, quote, have kept their culture alive and vigorous despite the relentless and organized repression of their cultural life, wrote Cabral. Cultural resistance was the basis for the assertion of a people's humanity and the struggle for freedom. And the growing discontent with the domination of the colonial regimes, especially following the Second World War, many political parties were formed, many of which sought to negotiate concessions from the colonial powers. Colonialism had been reluctant to grant any form of pluralism to the black organizations, but as popular protests grew, so there were grudging opening of political space, often involving favors to those who were less threatening to colonial rule. But such associations with freedom were tragically not to last long beyond independence. We saw the rise of popular discontent across the continent in the aftermath of the Second World War. Not a country on the continent was immune from the spirit of dissent, organizing vociferous opposition to and acts of rebellion against the colonial project. The response was, in many cases, vicious, brutal, bloody, with a widespread use of torture, imprisonment, mass killings, widespread displacement, rape, as seen, for example, in Algeria, in Kenya, Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau, and many other places. With independence, the opportunity arose for changing the form of rule, to dispense with the exclusivity of colonial democracy, to establish a real popular democracy. But what happened? In most cases, once in power, the national leadership, composed usually of representatives of the newly emerging oligarchs and their intelligentsia, they saw its task as one of preventing centripetal forces from competing for political power or seeking greater autonomy from the newly formed nation. Having grasped political self-determination from colonial authority, it was reluctant to accord the same rights to its own citizens. The crucial failure of the nationalists, in my view, was their embrace of the illusion that the colonial state could be occupied and made to serve the people. But the colonial state had been explicitly designed to protect the sacred zone and to police and control the populations of the sacrifice zones. The police, the armed forces, the judiciary, the civil service, and so on had been established to protect the interests of the occupiers of the sacred spaces. The colonial state was premised on the notion that its function was to perpetuate the dehumanization of the colonized. But failing to dismantle the colonial state, as urged by Cabral, led to the continuation of the rules by which the people of the sacrifice zones were controlled. Cabral urged that there has to be the creation of popular forms of democratic decision-making, an alternative form of state that is controlled by and serves directly the interests of the masses. In almost every case where there had been armed opposition to colonialism, freedom fighters of the liberation movements were, if not marginalized in the post-independence period, such as in Namibia, incorporated or integrated and placed under the command of existing colonial military structures, as we saw in South Africa. At independence, the only real change to the operations of the state was to deracialize the state while dressing up the police and armed forces in the colors of the national flag. Except during liberation wars in Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, there were very few attempts to form alternative state forms, and even then, these did not survive the occupation of the colonial state machinery. But for a period lasting from the beginning of the 1980s, and in South Africa perhaps a couple of decades later, it is true that there was some kind of social democratic contract between the elites and the masses, during which education, social service, support for the agricultural production, exercise of human rights, and so on and so forth were possible. But these concessions place considerable constraints on the emerging neo-colonial oligarchs' capacity to accumulate. The resentment against leaders such as Nyerere in Tanzania was palpable throughout this period, his period as president. Then came the opportunity. In the 1980s, we witnessed the restructuring of the world economy and the rise of neoliberalism. The oligarchs that ruled our countries, the neo-colonial countries, saw this as an opportunity to remove all constraints on their own capacity to accumulate through privatization of the public domain, grabbing of land, theft of resources from the sacrifice zones, grace and favor for those in the sacred zones, the norm of colonialism today that is called corruption, and the formation of alliances with international financial institutions, transnational corporations that enabled considerable access to a piece of the pie. The removal of exchange control allowed oligarchs to promptly export their new gained wealth to the banks and offshore facilities of the global north. And it was in the crucible of the establishment of neoliberalism as the dominant form for the world economy that South Africa achieved its new dispensation in 1994, perhaps explaining the speed with which it manifested all the characteristics of neo-colonial rule. It's important to emphasize here the accuracy of the term neoliberalism. I insist that this was the re-establishment of the principles of liberalism with its sacred and sacrifice zones under new conditions, albeit, of the continent. It was a return to the colonial forms of rule under new neo-colonial conditions. Liberalism is to colonialism what neoliberalism is to neo-colonialism. It was, in a sense, an expansion of the sacred space, which allowed the new black bourgeoisie emerging in our countries to join the sacred space. It's a complete misunderstanding of the nature of neoliberalism to think the policies that were required were imposed on each of our countries. For the most part, the local oligarchs were enthusiastic about the implementation of the policies that ensured that they would get rich and fast. In a few cases, where these oligarchs were not immediately convinced of the opportunities for accumulation, the World Bank and IMF were ready to apply pressures through conditionalities. But the political advantage for the oligarchs and their apologists in development arena, they could publicly denounce the bank and IMF while privately scoffing at the trough. I'm going to repeat that part, you can edit this bit out. It is a complete misunderstanding of the nature of neoliberalism to think that the policies required were imposed. On each of the countries, for the most part, the local oligarchs were enthusiastic about the implementation of policies that ensured that they would get rich and rich fast. In a few cases where these oligarchs were not immediately convinced of the opportunities for accumulation, the World Bank and IMF were ready to apply pressure through conditionalities. But the political advantage for the oligarchs and their apologists in the development arena was that they could publicly denounce the bank and IMF while privately scoffing at the trough. The structural adjustment policies that they implemented were dependent on perpetuating the existence of the sacred zones, now occupied by the new oligarchs and their allies in the middle classes. At the same time, there's been an expansion of the sacrifice zones. Today, vast tracts of our countries have been appropriated so that landlessness, unemployment, never employment, homelessness, the explosive growth of informal settlements, the growth of criminality as the only means for survival, the privatization of healthcare, education, water, anything and everything that can make a profit. In effect, there is a vast disenfranchisement of large sectors of the population, whose votes can now be bought at election time, but who have no say in the form of democracy that exists in the neo-colonies. Yesterday, we had rights to healthcare and education. Today, we have to beg to receive third-class care and forms of education that hardly differ from that which existed under colonial rule. If you live in the sacred zone, you have access to human rights. If the police want to search your house, for example, they are obliged to apply for a warrant. But for the majority who live either in the growing informal settlements around the cities or in the marginal lands of the rural districts, such formalities are never required. Police simply smash down the doors. If you are less than human, then you don't have access to human rights. In essence, everyone has human rights, or the rights embodied in the local constitution. But only those in the sacred zones have the right to those rights. Everyone else does not have the right to those rights. Under such circumstances, it's hardly surprising to see the police and armed forces carrying out massacres in our time so reminiscent of colonial practices, such as we witness in the killing of mine workers in Marikana in South Africa. Unlike under colonialism, the masses have access to rights only in theory. This has a number of consequences. For example, Abahlali Bashmandolo, the South African shack dwellers movement, can be represented by lawyers from the sacred zone, but the success in the courts is entirely dependent on the political organization that happens outside the courts. The decisions made in the court are strongly influenced by popular organizing. The exercise of rights is dependent on other circumstances and can be largely secondary and dependent on the organized power of the people. In other words, as individuals, they're not fully citizens. Many poor people can only survive by becoming clients to party leaders through patronage relations. In other words, the state needs quite a few people to support its party's policies, etc., and to turn up at elections to legitimize them. But thereafter, it can only rule through violence. It follows that the African neo-colonial state can pretend to be democratic. It holds elections, it has a constitution, it has a civil society and grants rights, which legitimizes it in the eyes of the West and in the eyes of the growing middle-class petty bourgeoisie who own property and have the right to rights in civil society. The latter thereby give support to the oligarchy and do not react except with crocodile tears when Marikana happens. The middle class in civil societies organize more and more in NGOs, foreign and domestic, especially in the churches. It is these NGOs which are pointed to as the evidence of the existence of civil society and democracy. The masses outside civil society sometimes organize in genuinely democratic ways, for example, Abahlali Bashmandolo. Not only popular rebellions, which are constantly occurring, but the possible existence of a new and genuine democratic forms of organization in mass movements. Without these, there can be no genuine democratic way forward. These are created by the people themselves and not by the petty bourgeois exhortations to stand up. The current COVID-19 pandemic further illustrates the different norms applied to the two zones. In the middle classes and oligarchs, access to vaccines appears not to be a great problem. When I speak to middle-class people in Kenya, they all admit to have obtained vaccinations privately, but not so to those who live in the ghettos, the so-called informal settlements. Instead, what we see in the COVID era is that in the sacred zone, your skin is pierced with a needle. For those in the sacrifice zones, it is pierced by bullets and clubs. In many countries in Africa, the immediate reaction of the state in the face of COVID has been to use violence, militarization of the streets, and repression, and no evidence of making vaccines available to the masses. Thus, while the international media talks about vaccine apartheid on an international scale, it's important to recognize that the reality is also that in our neo-colonies, vaccine apartheid is maintained internally within our countries. Previously, colonial rule was maintained through violence, killings, and displacement of the native. Under neo-colonialism, we see the use of violence, killings, and displacement of the people of the sacrifice zones. Some might argue that the situation is perhaps worse than under colonialism, but in reality, neo-colonialism is an extension of the same mode of rule and exercise of power over the majority. I think it is important to emphasize that our oligarchs are themselves members of an international oligarchy. Their interests are, in essence, indistinguishable from the interests of the oligopolies. There exists no national bourgeoisie that has an interest in the development of the productive forces, only a parasitic class that manifests all that Fanon predicted of them. They have come, he said, to power in the name of a narrow nationalism and representing a race. They will prove themselves incapable of triumphantly putting into practice a program with even a minimum humanist content, in spite of fine-sounding declarations which are devoid of meaning, since the speakers bandy about in irresponsible fashion phrases that come straight out of the European treatises on morals and political philosophy. It is too easy to blame everything on the global north. Yes, in alliance with our oligarchs, they are part of the problem. But as Cabral pointed out, true, imperialism is cruel and unscrupulous, but we must not lay all the blame on its broad back. For as African people say, rice only cooks inside the pot. The task of building democracy in Africa remains a vital task, the beginnings of which we are witnessing in the sacrifice zones, amongst the landless, the homeless, the destitute, the impoverished, and in the mass uprising that we have witnessed from time to time in Egypt, Tunisia, Burkina Faso, Algeria, Sudan, and many other places. But we also have to recognize that the struggle for democratic rights is only part of a process of emancipation and freedom. Democratic rights should not be seen as an end in itself. Cabral's statement that we must put the interests of our people higher in the context of the interests of mankind in general, and then we can put them in the context of the interests of Africa in general, reminds us that the struggle to reinvent ourselves as human is relevant not just for those in the locations in which such processes take place. They are of universal importance and have value for the struggles to claim and express humanity everywhere. His statement is also a challenge to the Eurocentrism of the many who assume that only the Western experience and its associated revolutions in Africa and America are of universal significance. The silence about the importance of the Saint-Domingue Revolution in much of the left literature is shameful. It is a failure to recognize that the experiences of the struggles of African people to assert and invent their humanity belong to the whole of humankind. Those who have for centuries experienced dehumanization inevitably and constantly struggle to reclaim their humanity, to assert that they are human beings. The process of reclamation is not, however, a harking back to some supposed glorious past when everyone was human, but rather a present and continuing process of constant invention, constant reinvention, and redefinition of what it means to be human. For example, those who have suffered over millennia from the dehumanization processes that are associated with patriarchy have an experience that helps define what being human really means. The gains of the women's and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, etc. movements over recent years have provided glimpses into the potential being that humans could become, countering the narrow-minded, tradition-focused, and often violent constructs that patriarchy portrays. In the perpetuation of patriarchy, men have themselves become dehumanized, unable to map out what being human is about. And it is only through the emancipatory struggles of those oppressed, exploited by patriarchy, that insights into the possibilities and potentials of what it means to be human can be found. Similarly, those who have experienced and struggled against the horrors of enslavement, chattel slavery, colonization, imperial domination, have insights that emerge from their struggles into what it means to be human, and what the potentials and possibilities are that can be released in becoming human. One can see in the struggles against oppression and exploitation the release of invention, creativity, different ways of organizing, different ways of making decisions in each struggle that takes place, as in the revolutionary uprisings we saw in Egypt and Tunisia. The anti-colonial struggles that Cabral led in Guinea-Bissau, for example, released a torrent of creativity in the way in which society could be organized, how education could be transformed, how health service could be provided, and how people could exercise democratic control. In every revolution or uprising that is informed by desires for emancipation, there are examples of such creativity and drive to invent what humans as social beings are and can become. One final point has important implications for those in Africa seeking their own emancipation. The process of dehumanizing others has an effect not only on the victims but also on the perpetrators. As Chinua Achebe puts it, we cannot trample on the humanity of others without devaluing our own. The Igbo, always practical, but put it concretely in their proverb, "He who will hold down another down in the mud must stay in the mud to keep him down." White people who occupied the sacred zones always consider that only their experiences are of universalist relevance. But so long as the experiences arising from the emancipatory struggles on the continent are perceived as merely African, it is not possible to understand their contribution to universal humanity. That is only possible, I argue, if the politics of the African experiences are transcended and considered as part of the human condition that belongs to the whole world. Thank you.